Waiting for you, Sylvia.
So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another BCC webinar. This time the topic is how to keep employees motivated and productive in a post-COVID world while working remotely. And I do believe that most of us are still working exactly this way. The speaker of today's webinar is Andrea Colantoni from CNA International. Hello, Andrea, welcome.
Thank you.
Before I hand Andrea the screen and the floor, I'd like to introduce him firstly, because you may use him and his services in the future. So Andrea Colantoni joined CNA International in 2019 as a senior partner, in addition to managing the Czech branch of CNA International. He spent more than 25 years in search industry, working for the best brands in the business. He started his career in Stockholm and has covered most industries, but as far as I've read, his key expertise lies in manufacturing, consumer goods, B2B sales, healthcare, and services. In addition, he also advises clients on talent management issues related to assessment and development, performance management, and succession planning. So that's a lot. Andrea will cover for us and for BCC members different topics from the post-COVID HR situation. We'll talk about motivation, productivity. We'll talk about the remote work in general and the science behind it. But also, and this is what we touched with Andrea last time, whenever we were preparing for this webinar, is what is actual responsibility of the employer and the employee when working from home. And there are these hot topics as, if I work from home, can I drink alcohol? Or if I burn myself with hot coffee while working remotely, is it actually a work accident? So there's so much to talk about. We're gonna have around 30 minutes to talk about these topics. Obviously jump in and ask questions into a Q&A box or ask after Andrea will finish his talk. It's all up to you. I will moderate this webinar, and this is it from me now. So Andrea, once again, welcome, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Sylvia, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody. I hope you can all hear me and see me. If you don't, then give a shout out to Sylvia on the chat, and I'm sure she'll solve that. I'll try to share the screen here to see if technology is with us. Hopefully everybody sees that. Sylvia, you can confirm, is that on? Super.
Yes, it's on, it's perfect.
Good. So, I mean, as Sylvia said, this is a wide topic, and we could probably be sitting here for many, many days to go in depth. And when we first started talking about how to address this, I was pretty insistent on that we talk about the post-COVID word, because I'm sure all of you are already swamped with hundreds of nice suggestions online on LinkedIn about how to handle these tough times. And I didn't want to be the 644th guy who told you about that. Post-COVID is much more interesting because it relates really a little bit more to the world of work as such and what will happen when we go back to normal, whatever that normal will be. And I think it's without doubt this current crisis is accelerating our digital preparedness. It's exposing the things we're not doing well. And I think a lot of companies are being forced now to actually explore how they're going to work differently in the future. Important is to say, I don't want to come across in this webinar as a fan or an opponent of remote work. There are a lot of pros and cons, but I will talk you through some of the points that I think are important. And as Sylvia said, you know, there are a few do's and don'ts, but that's actually, you know, some of them are pretty clear. But there are a few things connected to culture. There are a few new things that will come up that will challenge you if you're used to being a classical manager with an office team. And I think those are probably a little bit more interesting. You probably read a lot of stuff about, you know, how great it is to work from home. And yes, I think there are a lot of advantages for certain groups of people, certain professions, certain personality types, but also certain managers. I'm assuming that a lot of you are leading teams, maybe already leading remote teams. And I want to just start off with actually looking a little bit at you know, what does the science actually say here? Because when you read a little bit about the surveys and the research that has been going on, you discover that there are not so many real studies out there as in terms of scientific. And why is that? Well, one of the main things is that often this research is done by suppliers of some kind or service provider, which obviously have an agenda and they're driving that through research. And a lot of that information should be taken a little bit, you know, with a grain of salt. The other thing is obviously that most of this, as usual, comes from the US, which is way in advance of Europe when it comes to workplace practices and HR. And I mean way ahead, not in terms of being better, but certainly in terms of the trends. So I think you have to take the research that you see with a little bit of grain of salt. Yeah. Important to mention is that a lot of studies focus on productivity or motivation, but rarely together. And the two things are very different. And they don't necessarily have the same goals. Yeah, a lot of productivity studies really talk about how companies can save on the actual workspace compared to the cost and output, but it doesn't say necessarily so much about you know, whether that is actually good for motivation as such, or whether there are other things that play a role. So when you hear studies that talk about productivity, usually they refer to companies' productivity, not employee productivity. Yeah. If some of you are interested in those studies, ping me and I'm sure I can send you a couple of my favorite articles afterwards for somebody who wants. Yeah. And that's something that I think is important to say. Yeah, I want to make sure that people know this. Yeah, there are also a lot of costs that are being saved currently, but I'm pretty sure that in the future they will maybe not be saved at all, because companies will become liable for things that they are not liable today. Yeah. There are also quite interesting studies coming out now about some of the negative things about remote work, so especially mental health hazards. I'm not going to talk much about that today because it's in early stages, but there are quite a few studies showing that people feel isolation, they feel a lack of inclusion in teams, and you know, we are social animals after all. And interestingly, one of the main things that are coming out is actually the inability to create a work-life balance, which is very interesting, because in fact this has been one of the main arguments for remote work for a long time. But I think one of the main drawbacks that are coming up now is in fact that you never switch off, and you know, your employer is, or actually the employers are invading the homes of people, and technology allows us to do that on a 24/7 basis. So why do I tell you this? I think that when you read stuff about remote work, just bear in mind that there's a lot of different facets of it, and it's very rare that a study would cover most of that stuff. So this is really just to give you like the pros and the cons of that, right? Good. Not all workspaces are created equal, and I just want to show what, when we talk about remote work, it's quite easy to get a sense of like that everybody has a mansion and they're working from their terrace and they're sitting in their garden. But as some of us already know, I mean, this is not the case. Yeah. In fact, a lot of the work that is being done remotely today is done by the lower paid people who certainly don't have the facilities that you would expect them to have if they would be at work. So, you know, just to illustrate the point, all of this looks very fine. But you know, very often it looks more like this. Yeah, you don't have a work dedicated workspace at home. You're sitting on a chair which is not really suitable for work, or you get distracted by family matters, whether you want or not. Yeah. So why am I mentioning this? I think that when you build your team, or if you have a team, you're going to have to find out quite a lot about what your team members' individual physical environment looks like and their life situation, because it will have a huge impact, I believe, on their ability to actually be productive and be motivated over a longer period of time. Yeah. So even within teams, you will find that people have very different physical settings. And I think that's something to take very much care of. In the office, as a manager, you don't need to worry about it. When you have people remotely, you do need to worry about it a lot. And I think this is something we're going to come back to later. Yeah. We're going to split it up a little bit in remote work and motivation, and then we'll talk about productivity, because they are two different things. And I think it's important to somehow, discuss them separately. In preparation of this webinar, I spent some time talking to people I know that have remote teams, and I wanted to find out, what they felt worked and what was difficult. And a few things came up. I'm not going to give you a top 20 things to do, because it will matter quite a lot how your specific situation is. But there are a couple of main themes that have come up, and I think that they're quite interesting. Yeah. So even for the remote teams, a lot of managers talk about the fact that motivation comes from enjoying your teammates. It comes from knowing them, comes from trusting them, having a relationship with them. And even if you work remotely, I think it's important that you do get your teams together, at least in the beginning when shaping the teams, and ideally on a regular basis, to integrate new members and to reinforce, the relationship. Yeah. Some people may struggle with that because of budgets and costs, and you need to find ways how to compensate if that's the case. And one of the advice that comes up frequently is to try to have slightly lighter sessions, which are not all about Excel sheets or KPIs, but maybe a little bit more with other themes, agendas, and that have something of a social nature. Yeah. The other huge things that is coming up now when you look at leadership is that the availability of a manager who manages a remote team is actually much higher than when they have an office team. Yeah, this is obviously not scientific in the sense of like tons of replies, but I've talked to quite a few leaders who have remote teams. So what does it mean? Interestingly enough, it seems that when people are working with a manager or a direct report on a distance, they're actually less shy sometimes and more willing to engage with their direct reports. You would have thought that that would not be the case, but in fact, it seems people are more comfortable to send a WhatsApp or actually challenge in a group than they would be walking down the corridor and knocking on the door of that manager. So if you are today a leader of a remote team, you already know this, but if you're about to become one, then be prepared that you're going to be accessible and available a lot more than you might have thought you would. Yeah. And this means that, sometimes the conversation is going to have to be shorter. You don't write very long emails because you won't have time and they won't be read, because this is the virtual online world where things have to be short and sweet. So it's a lot more frequent communication with the team, with its individual members. That's, I think, is important. And the third main thing coming out is really about the tone that you use in emails and other communication, and be very careful about how that comes across, because you can, and all of us know that who have been in that situation, it's easy to write an email when you are upset about something or when it's a very complex matter. And I think that when you talk about how we communicate, that's going to change a little bit, and I think to the better. And I follow, there are two rules that I think are good, yeah? And some of you might know them. I call the first one the ping pong rule. And that basically is, if you have an email conversation that needs more than 3 emails, then that's not effective. Pick up the phone, call them on Skype or Teams or Zoom, and just hammer it out. Yeah? And I think that this is a great thing, because corporations have now, unfortunately, a tendency of copying everybody when they say emails. Everything is on email. And this is a really bad habit, in my opinion, when it comes to productivity. And I think in this case, what you would do with a remote team member is, dial them up, have a 5-minute conversation instead of sending 10 emails back and forth. Yeah, I know some of you may think, yes, but then it interrupts my work. But trust me, I think you'll have much less work because you will have so many fewer emails. I work as a consultant, and I can say, and this is not because of workload, but it's because I pick up the phone. I don't have a single day last year where I got more than 40, 50 emails. And it's because if it keeps going, I'll just pick up the phone, or I'll forward it. So use emails a little bit more carefully. The 24-hour rule, I think we all have been guilty of not adhering to it. You get an email or a phone call, you get really upset, and you want to write something back, and it just doesn't come across very well sometimes. The person gets offended or insulted or sad or hurt. And this is a simple common sense rule, which is simply about, look, if you're about to write something as a reaction immediate, then maybe sleep on that a little bit before you send it out. Reread it in the morning, and I'm sure a lot of us have been in the situation where we would say, look, let me edit that email and rewrite it. Because emails can and will be misunderstood. The fourth thing, and it's funny that I say that, coming from executive search and recruitment, but in the end, when you have remote teams, you're not able to make day-to-day corrections or regular corrections of behavior the same way you would do if you had them in your office. So in fact, you're going to have to take much more care about personality, much more care about cultural fit before hiring people. And that has not been the trend in recent years, because obviously, CVs look in a certain way, people need a certain experience. But when you hire people in a remote location, because some of you may work with teams outside Czech Republic, not just here, then in fact, there is very little chance for you to correct that behavior as you go, because you won't see them. Okay. Productivity is a totally different thing, because here we talk a little bit more about output, not just about the motivation. And I think, interestingly enough, for me, this is a little bit old school. Yeah, a lot of managers have told me that when you work remotely, you have to be super clear about everything. And that is from your expectations to objectives and KPIs to the follow-up and how you measure things. And this is not always the case when we look at sort of office environment, because in an office environment, we have something which is under point 4, which we call a visual confirmation. So sometimes, a lot of people in an office, and this we all know is true, but it's worth repeating. Sometimes looking like you work doesn't necessarily mean you are working. And this is the way you compensate for that. So stating goals, stating objectives, deadline in a super clear way, maybe even uncomfortably so for some managers, is crucial, because in remote teams, the morale can sometimes deteriorate quickly if they don't feel that the manager is visible and present. Yeah? The second thing that is happening, which is very uncomfortable for managers, is that this clarity, it works two ways. There seems to be evidence suggesting that people are much more comfortable over a remote or a video conference to even feedback information to managers, meaning, challenging ideas, asking uncomfortable questions, obviously within the sort of corporate rules of conduct and rules of engagement. But some people have told me that they were initially very much more challenged by their team members than they would have been in a classical office setting. And I think that, some things you will have to discuss in public with people, public meaning in a group like we have now, or a conference video call. And that's not something we're used to do necessarily. So be prepared that the conversation will be much more transparent, and that can be quite uncomfortable sometimes. Yeah. The third point is that when we talk about reviews before, because they tend to be then a little bit in a different setting, it's easy that, you know, people misunderstand the manager's intentions when he or she reviews something. And the reviews are for finding common ground. They're not for finding scapegoats or who did something wrong. You can do that in one-to-one sessions if necessary, but a lot of the reviews, it cannot be overstated how important it is to say that this is really how you make sure that everybody is aligned when it comes to common understanding of what the task is, what the objective is, what the KPIs are, the deadlines, etc. So going back to point one, and you know, of course, if you come to a new team or you're building your own, this is something that has to be reinforced quite a lot in the beginning, because some people that don't know you or are not used to it, there is a risk that they could take that as being dressed down in public in front of other people, whereas your intention might have been just to say, hey, where are we on this project? So be super clear on this, I think. Yeah? And you know, we're going old school in many ways, because I actually think that a lot of these things are old managerial skills, not new ones. But the new school part is the visual confirmation. I mean, you know, we used to work in structures where you could kind of tell if people were working or not. It's not true, but that was the common understanding. And the question is, what do we do instead? And I'm sure some of you are already using, you know, WhatsApp groups for company, you know, pushing much more on the CRM systems being used properly, keeping people active and reactive and involved in the group is crucial, not just for productivity, but also for motivation, because you don't want it to be a one-way communication. So this is really important. I'm sure I'm not saying totally revolutionary things. What is interesting about remote work is that it actually challenges people to go back to having a pretty solid, good management style. The new challenges, however, are totally different, I think. Yeah? If you're going to have people on remote teams, and we're already seeing even lawsuits coming out of this, you're going to touch upon areas which people are not considering yet, because we're all still talking about how good this is for motivation and work-life balance, but we're actually not solving things that are, you know, legally binding for employers. And you know, there is a reason why we have ergonomic chairs in the office. There is a reason why we have certain size of screens, and it's because many employers are bound by law to actually provide an appropriate workplace. And at home, we know that that's not the case. Not everybody has a fancy work corner, and sometimes, so you know, the question is, who's going to pay for the equipment at home? And I've seen companies in Prague where this discussion is coming up now, where people are saying, you want me to sit and work at home for 3 months? I need a proper equipment for that. And the question is, who will pay for it? The next point, actually quite interesting, snacking. Coffee, lunches, the fruit in the office, the donuts, who will pay for that? Or let's hope it doesn't happen. What about work accidents? Yeah, if you're being told to work at home, or even if you chose to work at home, so what if you slip on the floor and break your leg, or you actually, you know, slip outside because, you know, on the way to your car to go to a client? And these are things that have not been addressed in many ways by companies yet. And you know, it can go in different ways. I don't want to solve these challenges today, because this is a whole topic of its own. But when you put together your teams, and this is mainly perhaps for managing directors or HR professionals, you know, sooner or later, you're going to be faced with this or challenged on this if you haven't already been. So there are several topics around one working environment, who will pay for the equipment? And I don't talk about internet and laptop, I talk about everything else. What happens with refreshments and food and drink during work, and what happens with work accidents? These are things that you got to be really careful about. And maybe we can talk about that when we go to Q&A. I don't have the recipe, but this is a Pandora's box that in the US is already opening, and it's a question of time before it comes to the Czech Republic. And the last but not least, what happens with this? Yeah. I don't know how many people are exactly on the call, and I don't know if you're all sitting home with a glass of wine after lunch, but I can tell you this: during COVID, alcohol consumption did not go down. A lot of people are sipping wine instead of having their coffee in the office or their water. How do you even control if you have an employee who has been having one glass too many and sends the wrong email to a customer, or actually attaches the wrong file, or creates something which makes you liable, or which actually creates damages a relationship? I don't know the answer to this, but I do think that this can happen quite easily, because this is already a problem in some workplaces anyway. So what I'm trying to illustrate with this is really to say, when we talk about remote work, yes, there's a lot of talk about motivation, productivity, work-life balance, but I think the employer side, supervisors, HR pros, managing directors need to be aware of the fact that you will have to address this sooner or later. Some companies will probably address it by actually canceling employment contracts and putting people on freelance contracts, but that's not the solution for everybody. So just be aware of the fact that these things are happening already today, and they could jump up and bite you. And you need to be, if you're building a remote team from the beginning, I suggest that you address these issues immediately, so that you know how to do if and when it happens. Good. Now, we talked a little bit about, the do's and don'ts when you talk to motivation and productivity, but I'm a little bit old school, a little bit new school. I'm sitting at home because we talk about remote work, but I am wearing my shirt and jacket because I'm talking to you. But I think in the end, what is important is that, culture is going to be the all-defining thing. Yeah. When it comes to giving people motivation, making them productive, this is usually more a managerial and an HR problem. I think we overestimate the ability to motivate people externally. We really need to find people that are motivated. When we talk about productivity, it comes to the manager, and it comes to the manager's ability to draw the line in the sand. But culture is the thing that you control the most. And working remotely after COVID now, when things will be challenged, or building a team, this is your chance to really build and reshape a team and its culture to your liking. Yeah. And this will allow you to sort of create a working style that fits you as well. And obviously you need to make decisions about your team based on how you see the most effective model forward. So never underestimate culture in this. There are already talks of something, some of you may have heard about it, called Zoom Out Friday. And you will be challenged, I think, if you're not already, about things like dress code, about things like, do you have the video on during the call? Or is it okay to have pets and kids run around in the background? This may seem like issues that are actually trivial, but they're not. These things could make or break your team, in my opinion. So for me, for example, if we're saying we have a video call, I think it means a video call because it's supposed to replace the face-to-face interaction. If we have a phone call, then it's a different story. So, but there are people that are already talking about Zoom Out Fridays, in America, of course, but still, where they say, since we used to have casual Friday in the office, I think we should also have a video off day on Fridays when we do the Zoom calls. I don't know the answer to this. It's your call, but you will have to make it sooner or later, I think. Do we wear business attire when we work from home, or do we sit in our sweatpants? That's a thing that you will decide together with the company. And I would not underestimate the cultural part of building a team that's motivated and productive. I don't think there's a right and wrong. You have to build a culture that fits to the team and the task you have. But this is a question I would not underestimate. Yeah. Some of you may even have teams, and I have clients like that. They have some guys working remotely in Central and Eastern Europe, and they have a core team in Prague that sits in the office. In my client's case, that has proven to be quite a challenge, because there is a feeling of like a different level of sharing. And as a manager, if you have this kind of setup, you have to take extra care that all information is shared through the proper channels, because otherwise you're going to create a feeling that there are cliques and subgroups within the company, and that can really become quite nasty. So if you have a mixed remote office group, I think you need to be extra special care about people putting stuff in the CRM, on the cloud, and making sure it's shareable rather than passed on as a hard copy, because you cannot afford to have groups that are perceived as having different access to you. Right. The final, my favorite saying is culture eats strategy for breakfast. What I mean by that, if you actually set a culture and if you follow good managerial practices, I think that that's going to help you much more than worrying too much about a specific strategy. You'll probably have to execute a corporate strategy anyway. I would focus on making sure that you create a culture in which your team can perform. And in that case, if you do that, then the sky is the limit. I wanted to keep it short in case there are Q&A. I think I talked 30 minutes. Any questions on that?
Andrea, yes, there are a few questions, basically jumping from one topic to another. Sure. Nevertheless, thank you so much. This is extremely interesting, and I do hope personally that most of the things won't happen, at least in the Czech Republic. Nevertheless, yeah, there is, for instance, a question in terms of hiring. So whenever you're hiring remotely, what are the differences between hiring remotely and hiring a candidate in person? I mean, how the candidate can change? What are the risks for you as a potential employee? What should you focus on?
Well, I think the first one is obvious, and it's the fact, is this what we call the visual confirmation? I mean, one of the things I don't like about video conferencing is that you cannot look a person in the eye. I mean, it's as simple as that. Yeah. And one of us is going to be looking at the screen and the other one is going to look into the camera, and we're not going to meet ever. Yeah. So there is a reason why humans are social animals. We need this interaction. There is something called chemistry, which will not disappear. And I think this is the toughest part of things. Yeah. So what you can do is that you involve other people that work on the remote location, for example, that are your colleagues, to actually do the face-to-face interview for you. Yeah. I know there are industries where the hiring manager doesn't meet their people face to face, but if they go that way, they usually have somebody they trust doing that interview for them. That's the way I would solve that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question. So will it change? Will the world change in terms of separating people to home offices and to going back to work? So what will the employers prefer, and what will the employees prefer?
Well, I mean, yeah, this is a Pandora's box, because I actually think that companies will prefer it, and I think employees will prefer it too. And it's not going to be all pretty, because there are some things that will happen in the future, and I'm pretty sure big corporations are moving to that already. There will be fewer fixed jobs and there will be more gigs. And I think that that's not necessarily, it may give the employee a short-term satisfaction and feeling of flexibility, But I think there is also a hidden danger there, which is that, you know, obviously security is the first one. Job security will be eroded. I also think that it actually is a big danger for being promoted, because when I look at companies that are shared service centers or where people sit at home and do a repetitive task, we know whatever we say, and I'll challenge anybody to say something different, those guys will never make it to top management, because the middle management layer that we had in offices will disappear. And the middle management layer is not there for managing people. It's also there to prepare you for future challenges. And if that gap between remote work and management becomes too big, it's actually hard to make that jump. Now, the argument would be, well, not everybody wants to be a CEO. Yes, I understand that, but some people actually do want. And companies need leadership succession. So this is a dilemma that will have to be solved somehow in the future. And I don't have the answer to that. And I think a lot of liabilities will actually be passed on to contractors rather than employees in the future, certainly in North America. I think in Europe, we're going to control that a little bit more, but this is going to be a sticky point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. So going back to me, very interesting topic about the cultural part. How do the companies are setting up their cultures through this, let's say, Zoom or Teams right now in the Czech Republic? Do you already have some feedback? Are they more formal, or are they trying to be very sort of relaxed behind the camera?
It's more relaxed, but I think that may, you know, Czech companies are fairly relaxed anyway if you talk about dress code standards. So it depends a little bit on your perspective. We don't have strict rules of this in Czech Republic, with some exceptions, of course. And I think that the COVID situation made it more acceptable for people to either dress down or switch off video. Another thing that is happening, though, which I think is bad, because that's what we're doing in the real life, and it was bad already in real life. I think one of the big risks with Zoom and Teams is that now you can actually invite whoever you want. It's just a click away in the organization, but it's not always clear to people whether that means that it's optional to participate or not. Yeah. So one of the worst habits we have in work life, I think, in office, is endless meetings, endless emails with 10 people on copy. And unfortunately, the way we are managing it right now remotely is to bring exactly those worst things into the remote work. I see people who have 8 Teams meetings in a day. I mean, I don't think that's even an interesting job, to be honest. Yeah. So you're going to have and I had some managers who said to me, I'm getting invitations now from people in the region that I've never heard of, but they're senior, and they put me on the list because I'm a click away, and I don't even know if I'm allowed to say no or not. Yeah. So there's going to be some kind of etiquette developing about who do we invite, who is optional, what happens if you can't be there, etc. So this is still in a state of flux, but I think like first reaction from people is that, wow, I'm talking to people that I've never met in my life, which is great. But if they invite me to Zoom and they're vice president, can I say no? And, you know, that depends on the company.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Who can, obviously, in rather general way, what sort of employee can actually benefit from the remote working time?
Well, I'm probably not a good person to ask that question, because I don't share the sort of standard view on this in the market. It's obvious that the most suitable remote workers are the ones that are doing repetitive tasks that are easily controllable through automation. And those are the first ones that can go remotely, because they're doing things that you can manage, you know, quite a lot of people with fewer supervisors. And of course, the next level would be freelancers, people that do creative work, people that produce things in a more sort of task-oriented way. It can be a complex task, but it's not a continuous task. So that's probably the next wave of remote. But you know, there are many roles where you actually can go remote. I mean, sales teams, I think, should be remote, in fact. But there are some things that can't be, because if you're a manager, your job is also to be visible. And as long as you have a team in the office, I simply don't see a manager being the one doing that from home, because your job when you're a manager at a certain level is not just to do your job, is to help others do their job. And those people will have to be in the office. So, you know, one sad story about remote work is that if you look at North America, where this is much ahead, and this is one of my main arguments to be scared about remote work, is that it's beyond question that the people with the highest remote work level are the ones that are the worst paid. Yeah, that's undisputable fact. So it's not necessarily a good thing, because I think it will also push salaries down, because some people are willing to actually reduce their salaries to not have to travel. For some people that may be great, but it's not a static situation. There could be a slippery slope where we all actually just become outsourced and we're going to bid for work in companies. I mean, now I'm painting a grim scenario, but we are not far from that. There are people working on websites in America. They take jobs every day and they get paid money, which is absolutely ridiculously low. So the remote work process has to be handled with some care, with some social responsibility, and it's going to be quite affected about the labor laws in each country. So, you know, at the moment, it's going to be the more junior jobs are at home, or the more sort of freelance type jobs are at home. I don't see senior managers working for long stretches at home as permanently. But one important thing, final comment on that, I think there will be much, much more flexibility about working partially from home. And I think that's fantastic. But to have important jobs that are managerial, that are leadership jobs, that are 100% remote, I don't think it's even practically possible, to be honest.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much. There are a few more questions that I'd like you to answer, as I find them really interesting. Sure. Do you think that the work ethic has dropped while working remotely? Can you compare Czechs to others?
Whoa, that's a hot question.
I don't think it dropped in BCC though.
Can I pass on that one? No, I'm kidding. I don't think so, actually. I think if anything, it's probably gone up because people are a little bit scared of their jobs. I mean, like, this is not the time to be a slacker, if you know what I mean. Yeah, if your company is under pressure, and even if you are a person who would rather have a cozy life, one way of having a secure life is to make sure that you do what you need to do to help the company. But of course, in times of crisis and in times of you know, insecurity, that's where you really see the personality of people. And I actually think that if you take Central Europe, I mean, Central Europe has been very good at quickly containing the virus and quickly rolling out home office setups compared to other countries. And you know, I don't think, if you talk about this current pandemic, no, I don't think there's been a drop. I would say the opposite. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question that we have here, and you've already, Andrea, mentioned it in your introduction. How to handle these video aspects of the call? Should it be voluntary to switch on video or not? Honestly, you're not in the mood all the time to talk, as you said, you know, 7 hours to people through your Zoom camera. So is it really based only on the culture of the employer, or should employees have their rights?
Well, my personal opinion is that, of course, the employees decide, because whether you're in the mood or not as a remote worker is not my problem. I mean, if you would sit in the office or visiting a client, you would have to show your face. Yeah. So I think that, you know, we sometimes when we ask these questions, we're thinking like, I'm being hired to be remote because I don't want to show my face. But the reason why people are working remote is to be more efficient. It's not to hide themselves. Yeah. Excuse me. But
Andrea, do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, I'm here. I hope everybody hears me. Okay, I'm going to assume that Sylvia is frozen and I'll continue. The question is more about what you should expect. And I think that actually the company sets the rules, but it depends on what your remote work is. If you're sitting at home doing programming and you know, that's what you want to do you have to be on a video call with the video? Probably not. If you're a salesperson, then chances are you have to do that. So that's how I would answer that question.
Hello, everyone. So it seems that Sylvia has some trouble with her internet connection. So if there is any other question, ladies and gentlemen, you can type it in your chat box, or there's a Q&A section.
Yeah, I'm looking at that now as well, and I see a couple of things coming up here. Some anonymous, I'll see here, Carl was asking about disagreeing about that anybody working in information and knowledge. Yes, of course. You know, it's just going to be different waves happening. Not all companies are ready to go, you know, fully remote or partially remote. It's more a question of companies' investment level. Somebody is asking about, have you noticed any changing in recruitment numbers? Well, unfortunately, yes. The panic reaction the day after the lockdown was, of course, to cancel all recruitments. We even had clients who canceled people that had already signed contracts, which was a little bit ethically like iffy, because they had already resigned from their jobs and now the contracts were being rescinded. In March, it was a total mess. I think like about 3-4 weeks ago, people started forgetting about COVID and were already thinking about life after the pandemic. So from the last 2 weeks, there is definitely an increase again in the numbers of recruitment projects out there.
Yeah. It looks Sylvia is back. So
yeah. Hello everyone. I have no idea what happened. I've just lost the connection with everybody.
Yeah.
Pavle, did you ask the questions? Sorry.
Yeah, we asked one. So
yeah,
I think that there are other questions coming. So
I see a question here about how to handle information security and data protection. This is an excellent question because there are different approaches by different companies. On one side, there is a trend to wanting to have more secure data channels. For example, Zoom is under a lot of fire for this, and I know several corporations that have forbidden Zoom because of privacy concerns. There are some companies that have this, BOID policy, bring your own device, and the connectivity, which is basically open. But I think some companies really can't allow that, and they're going to have to work quite hard on creating virtual private networks where people log in. I think that it's going to go towards increased security. I can't really answer, Carl, whether the level in check is good or not. I actually it seems to me that people don't care so much anymore as private persons. You know, we're logged in so many places. We give our logins freely online. I could show you stuff in my office, how I get people's contact details that would make you cringe, but it's all legal. Yeah. So, we are the product. I think companies will struggle because the companies are obviously shipping sensitive data. So if you have to share price lists, client lists, you have financial data going over Zoom or Skype, companies will have to invest quite heavily into improved infrastructure by having dedicated lines and things like that. How is the level of protection in check? I really don't know.
Yeah, there's another question, so I'll read for you.
Yeah.
Are you of the opinion that policies and procedures should remain the same whether you're working from home or not? for instance, dress code, video or not, if you're working with clients and etc.?
I'm of the opinion that yes, because, you know, I think that a lot of questions that come about remote work to me seem to indicate that these are questions from people, and I don't mean the person asking the question now, that actually don't want to do the stuff they're hired to do. Remote work is not about, it's about employees and employers finding a way to work more efficiently, but the work that was planned still has to be done. And sometimes I think the debates shift over to how can I avoid to do the stuff that I would have to do when I'm in the office? That's not the point of remote work. So my view would tend to be, yes, you are representing the company no matter where you are, and you have to act accordingly. And I can even see, you know, another box opening if you wouldn't. I mean, then you have a discrimination box where you say, why can these guys do it and I can't? So I think that the rules, as long as you're employed on the same premises, an employment contract, for example, then you have to have the same rule. I think even by law, there is no way to go around that. So, but in principle, I think, yes, the point of remote work is not to avoid doing things that people in the office do. It's to help that person to do it more effectively by not having to come in, and the company saving money.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Andrea. We're coming to an end.
Yes.
So just to summarize this all, are there any positive aspects in the HR area that we could take from this remote working period of time and reflect it, you know, to the positive future?
Many. I hope I didn't come across as negative. I was just listing up some risks. I actually think there are for me two real positives, and they're going to come simply because we have no choice if we go towards remote work. Number one, it's actually going to force managers to be up their game. Yeah. If you want to be a successful manager operating remotely, you're simply going to have to be doing a better job yourself. So we're going to hopefully see the successful remote managers will be very good managers. The other aspect is I think that in the selection process, we will switch, hopefully, from not just looking at hiring people with 10 years of experience or a certain skill, but actually start doing what has been talked about a long time, but is not always done. We need to focus on attitude. We need to focus on values when we hire people, not just on pure skills. And I think when you work remotely, the cultural aspect become even more important. Depends on companies, to be honest, but I mean, it plays a bigger role. And you're going to have to pay more attention to it because there's not that much you can do when you're far away to address the behavior. So I do think those are two things that will happen immediately, and they're both good for us as a whole, as a society, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Andrea, yeah, as you said at the beginning, we could talk for days. I definitely suggest that we may meet together here on a webinar maybe in 3-4 months and sort of do the feedback on what was said today and how it's going to push forward. We've got many thanks from our attendees. So I think that's it for now. I would like once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank Andrea Colantoni, who is, as I said, senior partner at CNA International Executive Search. Andrea, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do agree, and we will talk about this later. We will place this video on our website so that people, if didn't have their time, sorry, they can look at this later. Mm-hmm. And I can't forget to invite you, Andrea, and also other attendees to join also our fun events such as online blind wine tasting, which is going to happen next week, May 21. So thank you once again to everybody and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you all, and thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Andrea. Bye.